Alright, so this is a special video lecture here. We're going to be going over the material in the third appendix on Boolean algebra models. And this will help you with the Boolean models that you're going to see in your class project. And what Boolean models do is allow us to study large biological networks. And these networks have, often have only a small fraction of nodes, which you can think of as, for example, genes, proteins, etc. Active at any given time. And what we like to have is just a model that can determine whether something is on or off. Because of the largeness or the scale of the problem, we would like a model whose states can indicate on or off. Okay, and Boolean algebra allows us to do this. Okay, so Boolean algebra allows us to do this by assigning the value 1 to anything that's on, and 0 to anything that's off. And this is beneficial. I don't necessarily know in this class if I've been able to convey that idea, but if you have, a system, for example, of a bunch of different genes that, whose expression sort of impacts the expression, for example, of other genes, which in turn express or impact the expression of other genes, and so forth, having each one of these have a numerical value, say between 0 and infinity, is a big problem to sort of flesh out. For example, let's say that this node here had the value of 101, and then this node here had the value of 517, and this node had the value of 14, and then all the other nodes were sort of off. As the number of dots here increases, the amount of memory or the amount of computation that one needs to go about is going to increase, and increase quite substantially. And so the amount of memory needed to sort of distinguish between 517 and 101 and 14, when you're really only trying to determine whether something's on or off, and you're sort of going to overlook the fact that it might be 5 times as large, right? 517, 5 times as large as 101. We sort of overlook the fact that that's true and just look at the fact that 517 and 101 are on, while this 0, those two zeros there, are off. And so Boolean algebra says, okay, this 517, we're just going to call it a 1. This 101, we're just going to call it a 1. This 14, we're going to call it a 1. And all the zeros, we're still going to call zeros. Okay, and significantly reduces the amount of memory that's necessary and the complexity of the model. Okay, so Boolean variables, Boolean variables can be brought together into dynamical systems. So think chapter 6 and 7 of Letters book. And then these things are called Boolean networks. Okay, so an example of a Boolean network would be, let's say we have 3 genes. One is A, one is B, and one is X. And let's say that 1 is a meaning for overexpressed, an overexpressed gene, and 0 is underexpressed. Okay, and let's say that if A or B are overexpressed, then X will then subsequently become overexpressed. And so the way that we write this is we say we use 3 operations. We can have in these models we can have and. So this is and. We also have or. And then we also have not. So if we have the not symbol. In letter, there's also an exclusive or, but we're not going to use those in any of the models we study in this class. So there are 3 operations. So here, for example, X is equal to A or B. So read here as A or B. And so then the way that this works out is if and so we draw here these truth tables. So for all the different possibilities, we have to determine what the value for X will be. And so let's do that. So we have A here, B here, and X. There are 4 possibilities. The first possibility is A is overexpressed and B is underexpressed. And in that event, since one of them is overexpressed and this is an or statement, then X will be overexpressed. We also have if A was underexpressed but B was overexpressed, again that's sort of the same thing, X will be overexpressed. If both of them are overexpressed, since this is an inclusive or, both of them being expressed means that X will be expressed, and then if neither is expressed, then X will not be expressed since neither nor of them are expressed. And so to write this symbolically, the idea is that 1 or 0 is 1, 0 or 1 is 1, 1 or 1 is 1, and 0 or 0 is 0. Okay? And so that's an interesting sort of one example there, sort of a really trivial example, but sort of, and again, an interesting modeling paradigm. This sort of uses the idea of formal logic instead of sort of the traditional mathematics that we have been accustomed to. Okay, and another way to sort of work this out is to construct what's called a Boolean function. Okay, so a Boolean function a Boolean function takes a Boolean variable or sets of Boolean variables and outputs another Boolean variable. So in this particular case, e.g. in our example, we'll call, let's say, f of ab, so it's a function of two Boolean variables, is just a or b. And so, for example, f of 1, 0 is 1 or 0, which is 1, but f of 0, 0 is just 0. Okay, so that's sort of how we construct these Boolean networks here. Okay, so let's go to a different page here. Let's do another example of a Boolean function. We look at f of, let's say, three Boolean variables, x1, x2, x3. Let's say that is x1 and not x3. Okay. So let's put in some examples. So if, let's say, this vector x, which is x1, x2, x3, is equal to 1, 1, 1, then f of 1, 1, 1, well, I need both x1 to be a 1 and x3 not to be a 1, right? That's what this not here is for. Okay, so 1 and not 1, well, that's going to be 1 and 0, which is going to be a 0, right? In an AND statement, I need both of them to be 1s. Okay. If I look at f of 1, 1, 0, then I'm going to get 1 and not 0. This not flips it to a 1, and I get 1 and 1. And so since both of them are 1s, the output is a 1 there. Okay, so that's sort of again, we kind of got to get used to this. Now, one nice thing to think about, so a shorthand way of doing this, is to algebraically create functions that'll do this for you. So one shorthand way of computing Boolean functions is to use real multiplication. Okay, but you got to be careful, and you got to define it rigorously here. So for example, if we say x1 and x2, okay, we're going to define this to be, again, x1 plus x2, and then minus the product of x1 and x2. Okay, so again, this is real multiplication. Okay, let's prove that this works. So if we have 1 or 0, this is going to be 1 plus 0 minus 1 times 0, which will be 1. That works, right? 1 or 0 is 1. 1 and 1, that's going to be 1 plus 1 minus, and now you see why this product has to be here, 1 times 1. So you're going to get 2 minus 1, which is 1, which also works. Okay, 0 or 0, that's going to be 0 plus 0 minus 0 times 0, which is 0, which works. Okay, so that checks out. How do we compute ands? Okay, well, the and one is actually fairly simple. x1 and x2 is just x1 times x2, and we work that one out. Notice here 1 and 0 is just 1 times 0, which is 0, which checks out. We need both of them to be there, so if either 1 is 0, that product will be 0. 1 and 1 will be 1 times 1, which is 1, so that checks out. And 0 and 0, right, neither 1 is there, so that's 0 times 0, or 0, so that checks out. And the only other one we need to be careful when constructing is the not operator. So we say that not x1 is equal to 1 minus x1. So notice here, not 1 is 1 minus 1, or 0, which is what we expect, and not 0 is 1 minus 0, which is 1, which we expect. So when coding our functions into R for the class project, these are the operations we're going to use to code. So we use these to code. Okay. All right. Let's move. Let's complete this lecture with a discussion on Boolean networks. Okay. So to define Boolean networks, let x, which is x1, x2 through xn, be a vector of Boolean variables, so zeros and ones, and f1 through fn Boolean functions. So we defined Boolean functions a bit ago. Then we define a Boolean network as the discrete time dynamical system so x1 of t plus 1 is the first Boolean function evaluated at all the x1s at t. x2 of t plus 1 is the second Boolean function evaluated at all those x's at t. Right, so it looks very similar to a discrete time dynamical system that we studied in chapter 6. Those ones were linear. These are Boolean, fn, x1 of t, x2 of t, xn of t. Okay. And so these f's, again, these are Boolean variables. So there are n of them, and these are Boolean functions. Okay. And so how are these used? Well, let's do one last example of a gene regulatory network that we would put into a Boolean network. Okay, a Boolean dynamical system. So consider the following gene regulatory network where you have x, y, and z all being all being genes. It's sort of what's called the synchronous Boolean network. You have three genes. You have X being inhibited by Y, and X inhibiting Y, and Z inhibiting Y. Okay, and you have X also suppressing Z, and that's with a blunt arrow. We're going to assume that both X and Z need to be present in order to inhibit Y. And with this, you can construct a Boolean network model. Okay, so here we'll move this up a bit. We'll say that X at t plus 1, well, all that has to happen for X to be on is that Y needs to be on. So we'll put Y of t there. Okay. For Y to be on, we need both X and Z to be on. And for Z to be on, we need just X to be off. Okay, so if we were to code this into a computer, we would just have Y of t, we would have X of t times Z of t, and then we'd have 1 minus X of t if we were to put this into a computer. But notice here then your F1 of x1, x2, x3, if x1 is x, x2 is y, and x3 is z, then that's just x2. F2 is x1 and x3, and F3 is just not x1. Okay, so maybe I have to clean this up a bit. There we go. Okay, and so that's your Boolean network here for this system of three genes, and which inhibit which, and which sort of prohibit the other ones. Okay, and so let's just do one iteration of this model. So let's say for example, if x, y, and z initially equaled, let's say 1, 0, and 1, then x, y, and z after one time period would be equal to, okay, well x needs y to be on, so in one time period, since y is off here, x is going to be off in that time period. Okay. Y needs x and z to be on. That's true here. So y will be on in that time period. Okay. And then z needs x to be off, which it's not. And so that is off. Z is off in the first time period after the initial one. Okay, and then if we were to look at x, y, and z in the second time period, we look at this. X needs y to be on, and that's certainly the case, so x will be on in this second time period. Y needs x and z to both be on, which is not true, so y will be off, and z needs x not to be on, which is true, and so that'll be on. And notice here, the 0th time period and the second time period have the same output, right? Which means that the third time period will have the same output is the first, and here therefore we have a 2 cycle in a Boolean network. As if we were to iterate this for multiple time periods, what you'd end up with is at time 0 you end up with a 1 0 1. At time 1 you have a 0 1 0, and at time 2 you have a 1 0 1. Time 3 you would have a 0 1 0. Time 4 1 0 1, and so forth. So again, then that's a 2 cycle. If you ever get a fixed point, a 1 cycle, that would certainly be stable no matter what, because there's no such thing as a small perturbation in Boolean networks. Every perturbation is at least 1 unit, because the units are either 0 or 1. Okay. Well, thank you for listening. I know this was a long-winded video, but hopefully this will help you with your project.